welcome everybody. It's Wednesday night at 7:30 in the Central Time Zone, so it's time for Cinematic Conversations. And as you may be aware, the Christmas season is upon us. You know, we've had Black Friday, Cyber Monday. We've had every possible way in which people can try to separate us from our money in the spirit of peace and tranquility and all the other things we're supposed to do. And I'm even wearing a red shirt. So to celebrate the Christmas spirit and all the ways one should celebrate the Christmas spirit, tonight we are going to be talking about Black Christmas, which you probably already know since you've already watched this film. And Colin, who teaches at TCU and this semester taught a class in HBO and taught a horror class, will be here to talk to us about that. So Colin, so tell me, where did you go to film school, and did you study horror films when you went to film school?
Okay, so thanks for having me, first of all.
Well, thanks
Great.
for being here.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. And thanks for letting me talk about this wacky movie. Um, so I was originally I did my BA at the University of Toronto, which parts of this movie are shot at. And so, I can talk about that a little later. And went to the other side of the country, and that was University of British Columbia. And then I ended up in Texas at UT Austin, where I finished my PhD, and then moved up the street, or 35, made the slow journey up 35 in my wagon train, and made it to DFW. So that's kind of my journey. My most of my substantial research was I'm writing a book on Robert De Niro in the 1970s right now, and so I got a chance to look at all of his files from all of his performances and stuff like that. So that was pretty remarkable. And finally,
How does one get access to all of those files? I mean, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment.
yeah, I mean it's public now. So he donated all of his stuff in 2007, and it's all at the University of Austin, and it's public. Obviously, right now you have to, you know, do things a little differently. But I was lucky enough to spend like 5 or 6 years, just being able to dig around in these archives and found some really wonderful stuff. And anytime you want, I'm happy to talk about that stuff too.
Well,
Um,
maybe we can have you come back and talk about your favorite De Niro film and
Absolutely,
all the secrets that you know
yes.
about that, and maybe go back to to Mean Streets and where
So
we're all started.
but in terms of being I know new Godfather 3. It's no longer the Godfather 3. It's called The Death of Michael Corleone. It's no longer the Godfather 3.
Yeah.
Um, but so I never formally studied horror per se. But growing up as a child of the 80s, I would walk into a video store, and that was really one of the things we talked about in my horror classes is the time to be a horror fan is when you're an adolescent and early teens and kind of in your early 20s. And you know um for me, this is also, I actually kind of grew up around the heyday of this era, right? And so these movies were just constantly present, and watching videos was really what you did for teen. I was a good kid for the most part, and so watching movies was my guilty pleasure. The other thing that was really, I think, quite unique about Toronto at the time is we had this really great TV station called City TV, and they would have
anywhere there's Christmas lights. You should most likely check it out. It's great.
Oh, okay. So it would play. They had something they called um, the the worst movies, and they played the best movies and the worst movies. And then one of the things that you could do is if you stayed up till 11, they would always play something kind of racy that had nasty words in them and stuff like that. So and kind of other Canadian connection, Toronto connection. This is what, if you've ever watched Cronenberg's Videodrome,
Sure.
the TV executive in that is based on the TV executive who owns City TV. So it's like kind of a
Huh.
weird inside, like I hope all of my Canadian references won't be too much inside baseball, but
And you of course need to say Marshall McLuhan then if you're going to talk about Videodrome, because he is also a Canadian.
yes, absolutely, and taught at at the school where I went to as well. And so there's a lot of really a lot of connections, and I think the other thing that kind of growing up Canadian in is this kind of bombardment of American culture. And what's really kind of interesting about a film like Black Christmas is it's a film that ostensibly looks American, like is indistinguishable, but there are like traces of Canadianness that you can kind of look at.
All
And
right. Now
yeah,
we got to dig into this right now.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
what about Black Christmas is Canadian, not American?
Okay. So I'll start with the fact that Black Christmas. I will definitely talk about the Canadian Film Fund in a second. But the first thing that I should say is what is Canadian about almost every as it's kind of like we can almost having if you haven't been sort of a colonized nation, right, you can never really find your consciousness except for the places where you can really grasp onto things. And so one of the ways that you do this in Canada is number one, it's a culture where you just say, I know, who's Canadian? That person's Canadian, right? Or you watch a movie, you watch Friends and you're like, who's Canadian? Chandler's Canadian. And, so it's a culture that points out who is Canadian to one another.
Sure.
But the other, sorry, go ahead.
Sure.
But
I
the
said,
other,
yeah, absolutely. It's like being Jewish.
Exactly. It's kind of being a minority culture in a majority.
And by the way, at the very end of this, since this is Hanukkah, we're going to do the Adam Sandler Hanukkah song, which is exactly that. It's like all
Yeah,
these people that were Jewish, right? So go on.
exactly. But another way that happens is through looking at locations. So, one of the things that's really interesting about being Canadian and in a place like Toronto is Canada stands for so many different places. So, I was reading today and I was like, oh, The Witch was filmed in Canada, Legend of the Fall, filmed in Canada. So all of these kind of quintessential like Canadian, American, what was the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, right? Shot in Canada. And so you kind of like piece together your an idea of the consciousness of your country or what
So
your
wait,
land.
Colin, let me ask you this because it's a really interesting point. So, after like all this, funding came out and there was, there were years when Vancouver was like Hollywood. So having all these American films, American directors directing in Canada, how does that subtly change what American films become when they're no longer shot in America?
Yeah,
Shot in
and
Canada.
I
Yeah.
think it's actually I think it's a really good question, and that's one of the reasons that they started to refer to Canada as Hollywood North, right,
Yeah.
as kind of a satellite production state. Um, so to get back to Black Christmas, what is Canadian about Black
Yes, we're
Christmas?
supposed to be talking about Black
Yeah,
Christmas.
no, but it's all connected, so don't worry. You know, but this is the first, one of the first successful versions of what was called the tax shelter films and the tax shelter era. And Canada didn't really have, a film industry to speak of, except for government funded. So there was a pretty robust.
Well, actually, wait a minute, wait. You got to mention the National Film Board of Canada
Yeah,
produced a lot of great animation and documentaries that
that,
were like really very, very important. You can't say
that's
that there wasn't much going
no, no,
on.
no. I was just about to say, I was going to say the two genres that Canada had invested in was documentary from World War II onward, which was hugely successful and still is, very much a tradition of, the National Film Board, the CBC, all of these kind of national funding arms. The other one, of course, is animation, which is still huge in Canada and remains, I would almost say like an indigenous industry. These are both kind of, indigenous, robust industries. The third kind of pull in Canadian production ended up being genre films. Okay. And so what ends up happening is there's no feature films being made in Canada at all. And so as with a lot of nation states, right, like only almost any other film nation will invest in its movie making capacity to resist ultimately Hollywood, but also domination of the market. And so what ends up happening is, to remedy this and to start funding for what they want to be called the Canadian Film Development Fund, they come up with this scheme which is called the tax shelter. This is the tax shelter film era. It lasts from about 1974 to about 1985, and it's basically this is how ridiculously successful it was. You could write off 100% of your investment in any movie that you invested in, right? Until that movie made a profit. So you could write off like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars until that movie became profitable. And it was, the intention was these movies aren't going to be, profitable, so you might as well fund them. Well, it was so ridiculously, successful that the Canadian film industry went from 3 feature films. Sorry, Bar, I didn't mean to. You are absolutely right on every 3 feature films to 300. What I wrote it down. 345 feature films being shot and screened in Canada within the 10-year period, and which is pretty remarkable to go from 0 to 345. And there's lots and lots of reasons for this, and I can get into, like, for the most part, because of the influence of Britain and America, there was just really no opportunity besides like a handful of films that were able to develop in Canada. And again, this is a nation that was not really even fully a nation until 68, right? And so 67, 68. And so you're really thinking about it in those terms, there's a lot of factors. Now,
What's really interesting about this is that in both the case of the National Film Board and then with this funding, it's the government taking an active role to facilitate and generate a film business, where in the United States, the government supported the American Film Institute, which really did not help fund films and really did not do very much, and still, to my opinion, not doing a whole lot to move the American films into a different place. And Canada had, what I would say, inspired leadership to understand the power of cinema and to put their wallet behind it.
Yeah, and I think there's like another couple of, because this was so wildly successful that they were able to start investing in filmmakers like David Cronenberg, Adam McGowan, Denis Villeneuve, all of these, really, what we think of as film artists now, all got their start in one way or another, in these, whether in the industry, right, which developed around these, around these films, or sort of independently funded through these the artistic, the more art cinema directed
So,
places.
Colin, sort of carrying this forward. So there's the part where there's the tax shelters, which is just enormously successful, because of course the hardest part of making a movie is not writing it or directing it; it's raising the money.
Yes.
And when raising the money is easy because you can't lose money, it sort of changes what is possible. But then the tax shelters turn into incentives. And again, Canada is so far ahead of everybody else in sort of transforming that, and that really transforms the film business.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, I pretty much, this we invented this game, right? Like now even states, there's a Texas tax credit, there's a, Georgia tax credit. All the states are competing against each other.
Right.
And all the nations are competing against each other. And in Canada, all the provinces are competing against each other. But we really, like, I hate to say, we invented a way to spin our global, the colonial domination of us. And part of that is being satisfied with what we could have, right, as well, which is, well, we couldn't have a robust feature film industry without figuring out how to game the system so that we don't necessarily have 100% Canadian content all the time. Now that's really complicated, because what it means is that a director like Bob Clark, right,
Mhm.
can
Getting back to the film we're supposed to talk about.
right, a director like Bob Clark, who is an American, can come and direct the film, right? And the film can still be, it can have Olivia Hussey, who's not not a Canadian either. Margot Kidder, yes, okay, and probably the secondary cast tend to be Canadian, and the crew tend to be Canadian. But it ultimately means that you're never going to get a fully 100% Canadian product, right? And so, sort of being part of being Canadian in these instances is like to figure out what parts are Canadian and what are not. And when it comes to the new tax credits for Indigenous production, it means that, for instance, if you want to qualify for the film fund, the Canadian Film Fund, you need to show, like, you have to have a diverse cast, for instance, to reflect the values of the nation as a mosaic rather than a melting pot, right? That's kind of what they say. You also they have to show Canadian money, right? I think 8/10 of the principal talent needs to be Canadian. So you can still have, a star who's going to sell your film, but you need to have, like, a lot of the other cast, or and definitely almost entirely crew, right? So it ends up being more of a like a craftsman nation in some ways than a like an artist nation. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's kind
but it builds an industry, and
of,
a lot of my friends who live in Los Angeles
Mhm,
say they only live in Los Angeles for a very little bit of time
mhm.
because
Yeah, I mean,
they're always someplace else, because there's very little, there's not as much production in LA as there used to be.
mhm. Yeah, and so for a movie like this, I think the way that Canada had to define itself
Mm.
um, was through these genre films. And so if you look at even if you look at like contemporary Canadian films, they're okay. So I'll add one more thing to this conversation. Catherine Monk, who's a writer on Canadian film, she covered it for a very long time. She defined Canadian film, and this is her quote, but I still, I get it, as it's defined by weird sex and snowshoes. Okay, that's the phrase. There's actually a documentary entitled "Weird Sex and Snowshoes." So where does this come into it? Well, if we really think about it, this the killer in this is like just a total weirdo, right? There's something really, really disturbing about him. And so, rather than just kind of see Canada as like an art film nation, really, all of this comes together in a guy like Cronenberg, who was, essentially actually ended up making the most successful tax shelter film of all time, which was Shivers. And if you've ever seen that movie, it's deeply disturbing, but it was the first profitable one of
Mm.
these tax shelter films. And is now Criterion. You now watch it on the Criterion. There's like a ton of Cronenberg has been venerated by, but would we say that these are, you know, uh, I think we can also see that this is really, um, did we invent the elevated horror movie? I don't know. Like this is definitely a slasher film, but it's got enough, I think, interesting components to it that it's not simply a slasher film, right?
Well, when was the first Halloween film made? Because this
70s.
certainly evokes some of that. What
So
year?
actually before, this is before Halloween too.
So this predates Halloween.
Yes.
Because all of the sort of, moving camera, there's a lot of the visual language that is very similar to like that era of horror film.
Yeah.
Halloween was
78,
1978, and this was 73,
74, I believe.
74. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get, I was watching this today just in preparation. There's kind of like three major, I could say uh, three major slasher films of the tax shelter era that are Canadian. The first one is this one. The second one is Prom Night, starring Jamie Lee Curtis, which comes out after Halloween, but is still kind of quintessentially Canadian in some ways. And Leslie Nielsen, of course, is in that, also Canadian. So just throw that out there. But also, and then My Bloody Valentine, which is 80. And so you kind of have these three very kind of distinctly different slasher movies.
So let's get back to the film and sort of where did this come from? Where did Bob Clark find this script? And, what is the sort of background for, like, how did it, aside from financially, how did this get made? Whose idea was it to do this?
Well, I believe it was just like, I think he was kind of a journeyman director at that point, and they brought him in because he was among the most experienced people in the country who could be making these movies. And subsequent after this one, he made, he made, sorry, he made Meatballs and Meatballs 2 right after this, which are actually kind of more famous Canadian films. And of course, he went from Black Christmas to A Christmas Story. So there's some odd.
And then Porky's, of course.
Yeah. Sorry, my apologies. I meant Porky's and Porky's 2. Ivan Reitman was the Meatballs director.
Right.
And he plays an important part in Canadian filmmaking still, right? We should also
wait a minute. I don't know that you can say Porky's and anything good.
Yes. Oh no, that's no. But again, if you really think about teenagers, right?
Yeah.
Looking at, they're just, bear with me, but as an adolescent, I'm not looking for quality at this point. I'm
right.
Anything that, and Porky's and Porky's 2 were hugely successful everywhere, as was Meatballs. Meatballs is still quoted today by so and Bill Murray was in Meatballs, so we can't ignore that.
So when was the last time you've seen Porky's? I mean, I don't know how one could sort of, what you would think looking at that today.
It was, it was like the 80s. It had to be. I couldn't, I must have been like 13 when I saw that last.
I mean, what would it feel like to show that in class, like when you were really in class with students, and how they would respond to that?
I don't know what kind of trigger warnings I would give, right? Like, I don't know how you could, I think there is a place for, for knowing that it exists, but I don't know. I don't know how you teach that at all.
So one thing about this film that is really interesting to me is, like, I was in college from 1972 to 75 or 6. And so these were my college years, and I knew people in sororities, not many, but it was just interesting for me, mostly just to see like what was on people's walls, and what they were wearing, what they were talking. I guess my main difference in terms of college life is that people were drinking in this as opposed to, let's just say, doing other things. I'll leave it at that.
I'll just, I won't ask. Yes, there's different laws up there too. So there's felony laws down here that I don't even want to talk about as a landed immigrant in this country. I don't want to get into any trouble over the wires.
So, do you know anything about how the sort of cast came together? Whose call it was on this, and what was Margaret Kidder doing before this, and some of the other people? It's really kind of an interesting array of people.
So I can only speak for Margot Kidder, to be quite honest. And Margot Kidder actually went on to become, there's probably like three or four, horror film darlings, right?
Hmm.
In the 70s it was Margot Kidder. She first went to, if you read Peter Biskin's book on the 70s, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, which is a phenomenal book, basically talked. Oh man, sorry, Gordon Smith. Wait, Black Christmas. There was a. Oh, interesting. Oh man. Okay. Very, very interesting. Sorry, that's a great comment.
Due to the Ted Bundy sorority murders, which had just happened. Wow.
Interesting. Wow. Um. So sorry. Now
But
I'm.
not in Canada. I'm sure it still ran there.
Yes. Exactly. City TV. So where was I? Margot Kidder, basically famously had gone, and Jennifer Salt were among the original movie brat gang,
Mhm.
and they hung out with Spielberg and Scorsese and De Palma and those folks, and then ended up, I think, returning for some time, and started getting cast in these kind of lower budget things. From here she went on to, after this there was Amityville was the other one, and then of course she famously worked with De Palma in Sisters, where she played a French Canadian, kind of, woman who has twin personalities, and really these, and then she gets Superman and kind of takes off again. So we have these kind of really, I think, interesting, um, cross border connections going on here,
Mhm.
as well. Just like, like, Leslie Nielsen, right, who ends up being in Prom Night, you know, and the Naked Gun trilogy, or series, or Police Squad, if
Mhm.
my preference, obviously,
Absolutely.
um, you know, originally, like a dramatic actor, right,
Yeah.
who gets cast, and Airplane changes it all for him, and so, you know, there's always a sort of, cross-border, I think, transience,
Mhm.
in Canada as well. And I think I read somewhere that, in my research I was looking that, of all of the, kind of nations on Earth, by percentage, um, I think 1 million Canadians live outside of their country, and like 800,000 of them live in America. And so, when we kind of think about this kind of, um, both, and most of those figures travel both ways, right? So, if you wanted to get funding for your Canadian film, you might cast a famous Canadian north of the border kind of thing, like,
Right.
John Candy and Canadian Bacon, for instance, or those sorts of things. So, it's interesting. Anyway,
Well, you can only get John Candy in a certain kind of film.
yes,
Um, I don't know what he would have done in this film. Maybe he could have been the cop could have
yeah,
done a good job with that role. Um,
definitely.
so what makes this film a Canadian horror film as opposed to, say, Halloween, which came a few years later, stylistically or casting wise, or is there something in the look or something else that defines it as Canadian?
Well, I would say, this is gonna sound really, like, it's gonna sound really wrong, but snow, obviously, I'll just say snow.
Wait a minute. My college years were in Beloit, Wisconsin. There was nothing but snow for a very long period of time.
I'm just saying it's on the checklist there.
Okay, it's
Um,
one of the elements. Okay.
one of the elements, but I would also say, I think as opposed to, uh, I let's say the depiction of women to some degree, and just bear with me for a second, because while many of them, if not almost all of them, are killed, I think that, certainly someone like Margot Kidder is a really empowered woman, right? She's not kind of she's not the necessarily the, um, the kind of how shall I put
Should we
it?
say empowered alcoholic?
Well, what I mean to say is she's a strong personality.
She's,
Okay.
but in the same time, there are strong personalities and weak personalities in that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would probably say the other thing too that may or may not reflect, and again, I'm testing this water here, okay? So number one, there's another one which is this is shot at Victoria College, which is a short, it's like a smaller college within the University
Mhm.
of Toronto, and it's shot in a it's called Ainsley Hall, which is the sorority house, but it's actually just a women's dormitory kind of thing.
Mhm.
It didn't have a ton of frat houses or anything like that. I would say location is another, but I would also say that's, you know, kind of interesting is its treatment of, you know, like reproductive issues, right? Like, so it's I think this interesting thing about Olivia Hussey's character is that, you know, she says like, look, not only am I not going to have your child, but I'm going to have an abortion, which is for this time period really, I think, quite remarkable. And I think it just speaks to for a very, I would say, quite repressed, if not buttoned down country. Okay, buttoned down is not, it's not the same as being repressed, but a buttoned down country, the willingness to tackle, you know, kind of complicated sexual issues, I think is quite it's not necessarily admirable, but it's just kind of a trait that that Canadian films and or, you know, works tend to deal with. And so those would be a few of the things I would say. Yeah.
Um,
I have a
yeah,
question. Oh,
there's a
and then
question here. Can we talk about the final girl as a trope of horror films, particularly slasher films? It refers to the last girl or woman alive to confront the killer. This film uses and subverts that trope.
yeah, so this is actually kind of complicated, and not to it's become simplified over time because people think they know what it is, what this trope is. But a really important scholar named Carol J. Clover wrote a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Okay, and it has this chapter on the final girl, and basically she talks about how, you know, I think definitely one of the tropes in the 1980s was that the slasher film is actually a very conservative medium, okay? Because, you know, as a reflection of, you know, Reagan era politics, you know, that there was a change, a trend towards conservative values, and thus women who are, you know, let's again, promiscuous tend to get killed in these movies. Okay,
How about
so
we
that,
just say liberated?
let's say liberated. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely a backlash against the 60s and 70s. We'll just
Sure.
say that. But what Clover says is she actually watches all of these movies and looks to the feminist potential of these movies and the way that they often subvert gender expectations. So she comments on a character like Leatherface in, you know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and she talks about how, well, you know, yes, he's a killer, but also he's a killer who, you know, ends up serving his family, and he's wearing an apron and lipstick for some reason in this weird scene. And so, you know, this idea that not necessarily that killers are necessarily transvestites or anything like that, as the term would be in the 70s and early 80s, but that there is a lot more complicated sexual issues or gender issues going on in these films. And so the other thing that she says is that the assumption is that only men are enjoying these films, and that's not necessarily true.
Hmm.
That there's just as big an audience for of women who watch these films as well, and part of it is because the final girl ends up actually kicking the killer's ass, or killing, you know, or stabbing or something, surviving through her wits. And it's rare to see what, you know, basically what she says is what's progressive about these movies is it's actually through these positive characteristics in the female protagonist, who is someone that you don't necessarily see in other movie forms, really, aside from like someone who, is disposable or, is a housewife or something like that. It's actually in horror movies, this kind of subgenre, and in slasher movies in particular, that you see these women fight for their lives and actually being triumphant against these insane obstacles and stuff like that.
Well,
And
but
so then,
not always being triumphant. I
no,
would
no,
say many of them die before we get to one perhaps being triumphant.
yeah. And that's the final girl is the trope there.
Right.
The thing that she says is that what's really interesting in terms of gender is that men watching these movies can see something admirable in these women, and the psychological issue, the psychological potential is that men can see themselves as these women who usually have, kind of names that are either masculine or feminine. So, Ripley, Sydney, there's a whole bunch of
Mm,
Lori, there's a whole bunch of these kind of dual names. And so this kind of idea that if people put themselves in the shoes of the main characters,
mm.
then it's possible for men to see and therefore like relate to women. I know that sounds really, really complicated. I've just like shortened about 400 pages of really complex, this really complex and nuanced book. But that's one of her main arguments, and that's what the final girl kind of indicates.
And that's sometimes what we do as teachers, take
Yes, yes.
a difficult concept and trying to make it connect with an audience. So how would you talk about the image of the police here?
Mhm.
Um, and also while we're talking about that, is one of the scenes I really love is the phone company. You actually see like how they find the phone numbers. Like it's first the earliest version of how one tracks a phone in a phone company that I've ever seen in a movie.
There's a really good, this has nothing to do with Canada or this movie, but there's a really good version of that in 3 Days of the Condor too, where he's actually
Yeah.
inside of the mechanism. It's pretty phenomenal. Yeah, I love that scene too. It also, I think, what would I say? Uh, where was I? The phone scene. Also, just this kind of idea that the phone calls are coming from inside the house.
Yeah.
It's really that trope as well. And this has all of those elements that of horror movies that that you expect there to be. There's this kind of dark place in terms of the sorority house. Um, I think the other thing that, okay, I'll tell one anecdote and one, I think that the killer is really complicated as well, and this kind of reversion into this really kind of babyish, like, is did who killed the baby? What's the baby? Who's the baby? Is it the baby that Olivia Hussey's character has? Which baby is it? Like, whose voice is this? But also the legacy of, okay, tortured piano genius, Glenn Gould at this time, right? Which is also a kind of, it's
Uh,
in the water
uh,
in Canada. I'll also say one last thing about the killer, and that is that where my sister lives in a town called Orangeville, which is nearby where they shot Schitt's Creek, she she realized that the person who sold the house, the real estate broker who sold the house next to theirs, is actually the guy who played the killer in this movie. So it's all connecting. It's all connecting here. Sorry.
I love the location of the piano recital in that
Mhm.
hall, which is, really not what a music room would generally look like, but I thought it was, just really fascinating. And the scene where he destroys the piano, I just kept thinking of like, did they have the budget to actually destroy a piano? They only sort of destroyed it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can't really put that back together once you've sort of.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think anybody's playing on that piano. So that yeah, it's just one of those things. So you want to talk, you have anything to say about the way in which police are portrayed?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's where we went. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fun. I love the guy who everyone yells at all the time, first of
Yeah.
all.
And what's that? What's that phone number?
Yeah, yeah. I also really like, I think this is where I'm thinking about Margot Kidder being a strong character, where she's just like laying it into these police. And I think that's, I think especially given our current climate, I mean, to kind of see that that kind of reaction from a person is, I think quite profound in the same way that it is in Get Out, right? Where she lays into where Allison Williams's character lays into the policeman who pulls over her boyfriend. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think it's interesting that the largely ineffectual nature, but this is nothing like it's something that's kind of inherent in the genre as well, like the idea that the police aren't necessarily going to solve the problem.
Right.
It's there on Halloween as well, where the doctors you know "Yeah, we got a killer on the loose," and then the other guy's like, I need to go back to, police tend to be really passive and buffoonish in these things. And I think this is across the spectrum of all nations of cinema. In horror movies, the police are not the people who are going to get the jobs done.
Yeah. They always get there just a few moments too late.
Yes, exactly. Or show
Um,
up at the wrong house.
so if you were to showing this in a class now, how many of your
Mhm.
students would know that people didn't have cell phones, that there would be one or two phones in a building and that's
Yes.
everybody had to use that?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I always have to just do the speech at the beginning where it's like, okay, we're just going to suspend our disbelief for a second. We're going to travel through a time machine without before the cellular phone era and stuff like that. I will say, that I watched the remake of this, quite recently,
Mm.
which is actually, quite interesting, because it's actually written and directed by women, under the kind of Blumhouse label, but it is ostensibly uh, a woman-led film, but also it actually has, it incorporates cell phone technology throughout, and so
Oh,
there's I think a lot of interesting connections with that. But yeah, I mean, it's tough to it's tough to relate, and this is not like those kids. It's tough to relate, anything that's not less than 3 years old, right? Uh, to college students. Yeah. It did take it down to PG-13, and it is less violent in some ways, but I think still does, some pretty interesting things with gender politics, especially given, you know, discussions about rape culture on
mm.
campuses as well, and diversity and what we should be teaching in classes and stuff like that. So it does have a lot of really interesting material that I didn't think it would have. I probably wouldn't have watched it if I didn't do this talk,
Mm.
right? I was like, maybe I'll skip it. But then I was like, oh, I really need to research. I need to do my research to just make sure I know what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. So, what does this film
Mhm.
have to say to us now? And what does this film say about 1974?
Well, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff about it. I would say, number one, I would say first, that other nations may have planted the flag first, right? So, I think that one thing in my research for this horror class that I was doing before the class came, it's that this is actually seen as a hugely important movie in the overall history of the genre, and part of
Mm.
it is because it does something new with the slasher genre, um, before the kind of before the big splash with Halloween, which is still
Mm.
an amazing movie as well. And we shouldn't say that one is necessarily better or anything like that, but it seems to me that there's a lot of horror aficionados out there, and I'm not into. One of the things you learn when you're researching horror genre is that you're not an aficionado, right? The scholars are not necessarily like aficionados of the genre, but that this is the one that the fans prefer. Or
Hmm.
if you really want to, have a conversation and prove your chops and your worth, you'd be like, oh, Halloween is great, undisputed masterpiece, but have you seen Black Christmas, right? I think that's the code word for entry into the club.
So what would be the sentence after that? But Christmas is, the best. Why?
Mhm. Man, uh, that's for the people in the know to tell you. But I mean, I will say, I think it just has a lot of really um, much more subversive material than you think. I think it has more meaty subversive material. Oh, and the killer doesn't die at the end.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's that too, right? Sorry, I'm scrolling down. I mean, there is definitely that as well, right? I think there's a lot of really meaty material that will get kind of diluted down as the genre becomes kind of cliche, right? By Halloween or Friday the 13th Part 32, um, it, this material that could be seen as again in a kind of 70s context might be a little bit progressive and is certainly dated now, but might be at least kind of reflecting the culture. And here we also have um, one thing that I haven't said about the horror genre at all is how it's seen as kind of being closer to the dream state of the nightmare Freudian. I'm gonna say it wrong, but the unheimlich, the uncanny, right? This kind of idea that we get pleasure in watching something bad happen as well. And so, as a kind of outgrowth of the 60s and early 70s, the sexual revolution and all of this stuff, we have a lot of that in this, baked into this text. And so, I would say that this has, in some ways, because it's more ambiguous about it, like it neither comes down like, virgins are bad, virgins are good, promiscuous, people who have had premarital sex are bad, right? Which is kind of what it becomes by Friday the 13th, because there's a lot of, it hasn't decided yet. I think that makes it really rich, I think, in for my analysis anyway, or for my money. But yeah, I would say that's part of it. And I think it is at a time when the horror genre, in terms of American or at least North American consciousness, is really coming to terms with the nightmares that are coming out of it, right? So in your talk about Night of the Living Dead, right? This idea of one most horrific image of that is, of course, it's not that it's not the zombies at all. It's actually those last couple images where the black man is
It's killed.
killed and thrown, not just killed but thrown onto a pyre, right?
Yeah.
In images that evoke lynchings, cross burnings, all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of like really, I think, deeply fertile material in here that I think we can examine, both in terms of its production history, but its kind of textual qualities, I guess.
So, might be interesting for a moment to talk about the sort of adults in the room. You've got the woman who's supposed to be taking care of the kids who
Yeah,
drinks a lot, and
yeah,
then you've got the father who is just kind of goofy Republican.
yeah, yeah. And I think this is very much in the, I would say, if I were like I think the other thing about the horror genre at this time is that the adults tend to be caricatured as well, right? And so, this idea that we live in a youthful world, and that horror movies about old people aren't interesting. And so, kind of I'm speaking as an older, right? It's just you don't.
Hey, I think that's a new horror genre yet to be done. It's like,
Yes,
yes,
exactly.
The
Well,
old geezer gets it.
well, and ultimately, this is one of the reasons that I won't. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but don't watch My Bloody Valentine, the '81 exploitation film, because it's about old people getting killed instead of like these youthful, right? And so it's just not enjoyable, right? It's like, oh, that guy had tax. This is why I stopped watching horror movies in my 20s, because I was like, started to feel bad for people, right? How's he going to pay his bills? That sort of thing, right? But when you're young, you don't have to worry about that stuff. And so life is much more expendable. And also, these lives of youthful pleasures are also a little bit more appealing, I think, at that point too.
So Colin, let me ask you a question. So when you were at 20 something, you made a
Yeah.
conscious choice to move away from the horror genre. What was that film and what did you specifically feel?
Well, what would I say? I would say, okay, well, kind of I mean, it's interesting that you should think that I should ask that question, because it really ended up being like David Lynch's films, which, if you really think about it, bridge the distance between horror, right?
Right.
The high school genre, and these kind of now discourses of what we would say are quote unquote elevated horror, which is the new term that we're now talking about today. And so,
Mm-hmm.
really has all of those things in there, and art, right? Because once Wild at Heart wins the con, then it's all David Lynch is a guy. And I would also say, like, Cronenberg as well. Cronenberg had, he had some really, some really deep material in a movie like Videodrome, but also just like the excessive gore, which is fine too, right? And so you can have it both ways if you want to.
So do you think that in the sort of heyday of these horror films that the advent of the video store really made sort of helped that genre, because not everybody's had a TV station like you did, and where you were able to see all these things on television. And I don't know how much of these were shown in theaters that were near and dear to people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the other thing that happened was they were able to be, multiply produced and stocking video shelves. And I don't know if when I'm sure everyone on this channel, I don't have to talk to the kids these days, right? But when you used to work in a video store, or sorry, I worked in a video store.
You did
When
work in a video store?
I ended up working at a Blockbuster for many, many years when I had to. But uh, you'd walk into a video store and there wouldn't be sections, right? There wouldn't be sections. You'd just be titles or in
Right.
alphabetical order, and you'd just be like, you'd grab the most hideous looking case for your friends and be like, yeah, yeah. And I actually ended up learning about they Blockbuster used to pre-censor their own movies. They used to get like an edited cut before getting them. But really, in the early video store days, you used to just grab. No, I swear, they had their own edit. I watched the corporate video of it. It's a real thing. I swear. I'll tell you.
Gordon also used to work for
Oh,
Blockbuster. So
Now, wait a minute.
you guys can have it. You can have it out here. You can battle out.
If
Both
any-
of you saw the truth, but you
yes.
saw a different truth.
Maybe it was made in corporate office. I don't know.
I will tell you, no. I can tell you this because every time this comes up, this is what I put in there. I was an editor for Blockbuster for many years in 2 states. And if
Wow.
anybody had been censoring the movies, guess who it would have been?
No,
Me.
no, it wasn't. Apparently, it wasn't a. This is what I understood it, the truth to be, and that the studios would pre-censor for airplanes, so they'd have that version, and then they'd also have.
Well, wait a minute. I knew a guy
Yeah.
back when I was in graduate school. His job was to cut films for airplanes, and he
Oh,
was
wow.
not working for a studio. It's like
Okay.
there was some
That's
company.
quite a different thing.
Right. And I mean, their job was, how do you take an hour-and-a-half film and
Wow.
make it make sense in 40 minutes?
Wow. Yeah, those are interesting.
Blockbuster, they got in a lot more trouble just for the cover boxes of slasher and horror movies. And more than once, we had to kind of do a purge or ask a vendor, can you come up with a less offensive cover box that's not a naked girl and a bloody knife?
Well,
And
But that's what sold the films. I
Yeah.
I
mean,
know,
well,
that's, I mean, the whole point of why, I, back in those days, I would tell my students to go and spend a half an hour watching people decide what movies to see in Blockbuster.
Yeah.
And, all these people with grandiose ideas of being an auteur, and look at what it is that people are making their decisions based on. And it's quite revealing.
I remember the
there,
first time.
there was
Sorry.
frequently a call to remove those boxes, but the thing is, very few of them actually got removed or changed. And the only time studios edited something just for Blockbuster, Blockbuster never had any problem with something that was rated R.
Mhm.
If it was an unrated video that we looked at, and occasionally that was my job to look at and go, yeah, this would be an NC-17 if it had a rating. So they would make a request to the vendor and said, okay, if you can get a rating for this, get an R rating, or if you need to make some cuts, resubmit it, get an actual R rating, and Blockbuster would be more than happy to carry it. But
And I mean, to this day, I've only seen, just bear with me for a second, the edited version of Man Bites Dog, which does not, do you remember this Belgian movie, Man Bites
I
Dog?
know Man Bites Dog was originally NC-17, and
Yeah.
Blockbuster had a rule against carrying anything with an actual X or NC-17 rating.
So I watched it, they had an R-rated version of that. I know there's an NC-17 version, but I will never watch it because the version that I saw is like awesome. And then I was like, oh, but they find a pregnant woman and kill her and cut out the baby. I'm like, no, I never want to see that. So anyway, that's my.
It was the same with The Cook, the Thief, Her Wife, and Her Lover. It was the same with Showgirls,
Yes.
and but these were exceptions. I mean, it's not like Blockbuster did that with everything. Just certain things
Oh,
they
no.
thought would sell well.
Ah,
And Blockbuster had plenty of things in the foreign section that was not rated that would have been NC-17, like Paul Verhoeven's early films. But the thing was, the general feeling was anybody who'd be going to the foreign section and renting something there in the first place kind of knows what they're in for.
right. None of them Christians went into the foreign section.
Not much.
Yeah.
So Colin, before we leave, did you have something coming out, a book coming out, some articles coming out, any research that you want to talk about that you're thinking about, or do you have any thoughts about contemporary cinema as we get to the end of this amazing year we've been driving through?
So I'll say a couple of things, I guess, of shameless self-promotion. I do have a book on Steven Soderbergh out from a couple of years ago. I published in 2013, which actually is really what ends up only being about the first half of his career, because it ends in like just before he retires. And now I'm working on kind of the second half of his career. So his move to TV, kind of his prolific out production after that.
He is certainly a unique character in the kind of films that he does, and yes, and worthy of more writing. So where can one find this book? On Amazon, I imagine?
It is on Amazon, yeah, right now. And right now I'm writing on The Nick. I don't know if you guys have seen that. His show is like a 2-season-long show. It was on Cinemax, and it's actually really quite remarkable. And it's basically Soderbergh does TV in a kind of medical drama about 1900s surgery. It's really quite, and it looks like there might be a green light for a sequel to this show, which Barry Jenkins will be taking over with the same characters in it. So look for that coming up.
Let me ask you one question to wrap up, since you are.
I will also shamelessly promote my De Niro book, which is, I'm submitting the manuscript. It's only his 70s films, so it goes from his theater work to The King of Comedy. And then I'm submitting that manuscript in March.
Well,
So
we
sorry.
should, when that gets close to coming out, we should bring you back and have you do, we can do Mean Streets or King of Comedy, which I think has a lot of things to say. So very quickly, because we are officially 2 minutes into
Oh, man.
overtime, as somebody who teaches film history and film aesthetics, um, where do you place like what I call cinematic television now? I mean, you're teaching class in HBO. From an academic point of view, where do you draw that line in terms of what it is that we're teaching and what it is that people are making? And you have
Well,
2 minutes to do this.
okay. Well, I think what's really interesting right now is, and this is what I'm writing about at this particular moment with Soderbergh, is that in the 90s, the early late 80s, early 90s, you have the indie film moment, and then the bottom falls out of it, right? The bottom, like all of the it gets taken over by Disney, all of these into Indiewood, and then there's no opportunity. So for Soderbergh, by the time he makes Che, he couldn't find a distributor for that movie, despite the fact that it went at Cannes, that Benicio del Toro won the award. So what ends up happening is, with the contraction of the industry, the indie sector moves to TV, right? And so you get these much longer, more sophisticated actors moving to these kind of longer form narratives and stuff like that. So, I would say what we had in the indie moment is, sophisticated narratives. Da, 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 da. Now we are now kind of experiencing TV in this amazing renaissance of great shows. Now, obviously, I mean, the bottom's going to drop out soon too, because, there's a pandemic, and, a gazillion different other reasons. But eventually, Netflix is going to run out of money because they've been, like basically borrowing billions and billions of dollars every year and not really being profitable in the way that you would expect them to be. And so eventually this is gonna, who knows where the whack-a-mole is going to go next, but hopefully it'll, we'll have another indie renaissance or something like that, either in terms of TV or film. But I think the best part is that directors no longer have to decide, actors no longer have to decide, and it used to be that these were silos, and no longer is that, I think, really the case.
Well, on that, I want to thank you so much for this really fascinating discussion. It's
It was
just really
absolutely my
wonderful
pleasure.
to and Colin, we do this every Wednesday night. Come on back and join the discussion.